I'm Emma Grooms, and I'll be doing a presentation on the benefits of genetic engineering and plant biotechnology for the environment and why we should all be investing in this research. So for introduction, the world's population is increasing by 1.7%, which is a huge amount, and if it continues to increase at this rate, we will need to increase our food production by up to 70% by the year 2050. But as we've grown, we've realized the detrimental effects of our agricultural practices on the environment. So as the world population grows, it's becoming very, very important for us to figure out how to grow more food on less land and by using less energy. So my presentation is going to focus on three main areas of research that are helping us achieve these goals. Now there are many other areas, but these are three of the biggest that I'll be focusing on. And they're nitrogen and phosphorus use efficiency, disease and pest resistance, and water and salinity. So I'm going to start with nitrogen and phosphorus because this is the area that we know the least about. Nitrogen and phosphorus are two major macronutrients for plants and two of the main components of fertilizer. So nitrogen regulates gene expression, metabolism, and growth and development. And then phosphorus converts nutrients into usable building blocks, is a component of DNA, enhances fertility and yield, but it can only be used in certain plant available forms. So often the phosphorus in fertilizer ends up reacting with certain metals such as aluminum or iron and becomes unavailable to the plant. So fertilizer is a huge CO2 emitter. This is a flow chart of how fertilizer is made, and as you can see, it's one big CO2 emitting machine after another. So being able to decrease our amount of fertilizer used would greatly decrease our CO2 emissions. So nitrogen's a hard one because we don't understand a whole lot about how it's used, and so it's hard to manipulate plants to make them use nitrogen more efficiently. But a study was done by Zulago and his team, and they discovered 13 new genes that help with nitrogen stress tolerance, which hopefully the next few years we'll be able to insert into other plants to make them more nitrogen efficient and thus decreasing our fertilizer needs. The next one that is a big deal is phosphorus, and again, phosphorus is the one that's hard to keep in the soil because it reacts with metals and becomes unavailable to the plant. So in this picture we have a picture of sewage sludge, which holds a lot of already plant available phosphorus, and in a study done by Krogstad and his team, they analyzed 5 different sewer sludges and found 2 which have more plant available phosphorus than the current fertilizer is using. And over here we have a picture of sulfur oxidizing bacteria, which oxidizes sulfur, which then reacts with metals that have bonded with phosphorus and can make the phosphorus in the soil plant available. So we wouldn't have to make any more fertilizer because we can just take the phosphorus already there and make it available to plants. There are a couple problems with these. Sewage sludge is heavier than fertilizer, so it would take more energy to distribute it, but knowing that we wouldn't have to make it anymore would still save a lot of energy. The bacteria is a harder one because you always have to consider what you are might be doing to the soil by introducing a foreign bacteria. However, overall, it would still save lots of energy to be able to use either of these other systems. Moving on to pest and disease. So half of the food produced on farms doesn't even make it to the supermarket shelves because it's been contaminated. Weeds have choked it out, it's been eaten by a worm, it's got a fungi spot on it, lots of different things. So being able to create plants that are resistant to these things would greatly decrease the amount of farmland needed to grow the food that we need. So start with pest resistance. The biggest pest out there is weeds. And currently the best practice is to grow herbicide resistant crops and then spray with herbicide. However, not all crops are herbicide resistant, and many of them have been considered very fragile and you can't have an herbicide resistant variety. However, Chen and his team were able to transform Lysanthus with a Basta resistance gene and found that they were resistant to the herbicide Basta, which is huge because Lysanthus is a very fragile plant that has been hard to transform in the past. And then over here we have a picture of strawberries that have been contaminated by fungi, And fungi is a hard one because it's hard to spray fields for fungi because you'll often end up killing the plant. And so a study was done by Nunez and his team where they transformed lilies with a gene found in rice that codes for an enzyme that breaks down the cell walls of fungi, and they found that these flowers were almost completely resistant to the fungi, and their control plants all died during the trial. So this is huge. Being able to grow plants like this that are resistant to herbicides and to fungi would greatly reduce the amount of land needed to grow crops to sustain our growing population. Disease resistance, basically the same problems. The food doesn't reach the supermarket because it's been contaminated. So this picture is a picture of a plant that's been contaminated by cucumber mosaic virus, which is a huge threat to many of the crops in the United States. And so Kumar and his team transformed chrysanthemums with the coat protein for CMV, which gave it resistance. And then over here we have bacterial wilt disease, and Sriwasa and her team created carnations that were almost completely resistant to bacterial wilt disease. And again, this is huge because if these plants are naturally resistant to these diseases, then way more of what's being produced in the fields can actually be used. And if we can get this really good, then we might even be able to reduce the amount of farmland we're using and be able to use it for, natural wildlife preserves and other things like that. So the last section is going to be water and salinity. It's no secret that plants need water to survive, and a drought can majorly destroy crops and make it so we have a huge shortage of food. Too much salt in the soil and the water is also a huge problem. Salt in the soil will totally deregulate the plant's ion concentration, causing many plants to die. So for drought tolerance, we have a study by Ho and his team in which they increased drought tolerance in creeping bent grass by overexpressing the OSME393A gene. And this is really cool because creeping bent grass already has this gene that gives it a little bit of drought tolerance, and by overexpressing that, they've made it so that it's significantly more drought tolerant and needs significantly less water to grow. And then on the flip side, Zhu and his team increased drought tolerance by knocking out an Eskimo-1 gene, which basically just keeps a plant from growing when it's under water stress. And so by knocking that out, they've made a plant that will continue to grow even if it has less water. And this is huge because if we can use less water on our plants, that saves massive amount of energy in both irrigation and things. It makes drought a far less threat. It makes it so that we can use more of the Earth's natural water, or more of Earth's natural water can be used in natural preserves and things like that. So next is salt tolerance. So this is a picture of an antiporter, a very simplified antiporter which controls the ion concentration in a plant cell. And in a study done by Baghor and his team, they crossed two already transgenic plants, one that had a special salt antiporter that gave it salt tolerance, and one for a different kinase that also helped better regulate the salt tolerance. And this study is very cool because it shows us how far we've already gone, and that they didn't have to make a new transgenic plant. They just crossed two plants that were already transgenic and created a new plant that had both of these very desirable traits. And then on the flip side, there was a study done by Chen where they found a new antiporter that gives salt tolerance to upland cotton, and they then inserted that into Arabidopsis, and it gave it salt tolerance, much higher salt tolerance than it previously had. And this is huge because if we can give plants more salt tolerance, then we can water them with more of Earth's natural water, leaving the fresh water to water things that have been endangered through our current agricultural practices. And also we won't have to use so much energy to desalinize water to then get it to these plants. So in conclusion, all of these things we've talked about, the pest and disease tolerance, the nitrogen and phosphorus use efficiency, and the water and salt salinity are just the tip of the iceberg of what's being done today in the field of plant biotechnology and genetic engineering. And if we are going to support the growing population of the world and keep our natural habitats and the environments healthy, this is 100% the field that needs to be funded and supported in order to keep our environment healthy and feed the world's growing population.